Hello, welcome to the Hard Talk with Sally. In today's podcast, we're about to discuss literacy development. More specifically, development process of those English as additional language students. But before, let's first acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we walk and pay our respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. For most of the native speakers, language acquisition happens naturally and automatically, and perhaps you have already forgotten your language learning struggles. I hope our discussion with Charlie today could help to pick up our experience of English learning and appreciate your teacher's work from a different angle. Now, welcome to the show, Charlie. As a final year student of Melbourne University Master of Teaching program and a future teacher researcher, you have been conducting this research about EAL students' literacy development for about 7 months. What raised your interest in this particular issue?
Well, literacy development has always been a major concern in education practice. Specific to international students, let me first introduce some background to our elders. It has been over 20 years since the first group of international students was admitted in Victorian secondary schools. We have seen that international students have now become a source of funding to secondary schools as the number of overseas enrollment has been constantly increasing. However, international students at the tertiary level seem to attract most of the public attention, and there are not enough research to deal with the situation of international students in Australian secondary schools. Apart from that, my teaching experience further led me to dive into this topic. I can recall that students have always asked me to explain some tier 2 or tier 3 words when I was doing my first placement last year. And when I got the chance to assess the SAC, I found that even those who seemed to be good international students had problems with language issues. Apart from that, the pandemic forces me to go back to placement school 6 months after completing the first half, which gives me the perfect opportunity to check students' literacy development. Among those students, a year 9 Chinese student stands out as her progress is phenomenal. She almost buried herself in her arm and responded to nothing in term 1. However, 6 months later, she can keep up with others with the help of Google Translation and dictionary. All this experience led me to wonder what I can do to diffuse language problem and improve students' literacy skills.
Correct me if I'm wrong, you're preparing to be a high school economics teacher. How does this role have anything to do with English learning? Because most of the audience, including me, have been holding this view that is, literacy is the main focus of English teacher.
Well, what I can tell is fluency in English is a basic factor that affects students' attainment of all subjects. Unfortunately, most of the international students have only 3 years to solve the language problem, as most of the international students commence their study in Australia in the year 10. So my opinion is that the teaching strategies and the responsibility of content area teachers can't be ignored. This is because teaching language alone is not that effective in terms of lifting EAD learners up from their everyday struggle. The nature of academic language helps to cope with EAD language problems, as language is never an isolated concept and should be used in varying and meaningful circumstances. My teaching area economics is naturally rich in context and has connections with a wide variety of realms, such as managing, accounting, and other social studies. Apart from that, economic literacy is different from the common literacy we are referring to. From my perspective, it merges the language we use every single day, as well as those words that have explicit economic traits to study different economic phenomena. There's several words such as capital, inflation, and elasticity that have other definitions outside of economics. There are also terms such as allocative efficiency and externalities that we barely see except business-related subjects like economics. At this point, economic teachers can certainly help. However, many economic teachers in Victoria claim that they have no time, resources, and relative skills to help international students cope with the language problem. Hogwarts found that some content teachers lack the patience and understanding and confidence to meet the language needs of the international students. Researchers also found that some content teachers do not believe it is their responsibility to develop international students' English competence, and more often than that, they identify themselves as specialists of their own teaching area. Ironically, economics and business studies are the majors that a large number of internet students would like to study in the university.
Fantastic. Tell me more about your research. How could it stand out from a variety of similar researchers that focused on EALD learners' literacy development?
Well, to answer that question, I want to talk you through my literature review because this is where I started off this substantive research. For much of its history, the language teaching profession has been obsessed with the search for the best method of teaching a second foreign language. The search was based on the belief that ultimately there must be a method that works better than any other for learners everywhere, regardless of their biographical. So my initial attempt was to find a method that fits with my teaching style and economic learning, so that the language problem would be solved once and for all. The mainstream language teaching methods people normally use are grammar translation, or linguism, and communicative language teaching. Now, focusing on written rather than the spoken language, the grammar translation method, as the name suggests, focus on the explicit teaching of grammar rules. Learners also spend much time translating from the first to the second language and vice versa. The crux of the criticism was that the students who had been taught with a language through the grammar translation method know a good deal about the target language, but couldn't actually use it to communicate. This was particularly true of the spoken language, which is not surprising as learners often had virtually no exposure to the spoken language. This was profoundly unsatisfactory to government bodies that needed economists, diplomats, and others who could learn to speak the target language and could develop the skills rapidly rather than over the course of years. Many theorists describe autolinguism as the most popular of all the language teaching methods. Autolinguism is underpinned by the theory of language and the theory of learning. Language learning was thought to depend on habits that could be established by repetition. Teaching techniques make use of repetition of dialogues and pattern practice as a basis for automation, followed by exercises that involve transferring learned patterns to new situations. In the 1970s, autolinguism came in for some severe criticism. People said that it fails to adequately account for key aspects of language and language teaching. This period also coincides with the emergence of designers' methods and the rise of communicated language teaching. While communicated language teaching was less a method than a broad philosophical approach to language, viewing it not so much as a system of rules, but as a tool for communication. Duff provides the following introduction to the approach. Communicated language teaching is an approach to language teaching that emphasizes learning a language first and promotes for the purpose of communicating with others. The communication process could be rendered verbally or via written materials. To sum up, the methodological realization of CLT is task-based language teaching. Coming back from the literature, this project is not identical with others as it is characterized by what I call self-study methodology. First of all, although self-study is self-initiated, it moves beyond the self, impacting the researcher's practice, students, and the field of education. The methodology chosen for this study reflects the master's work, which has been gleaned, refined, and extended from almost 2 decades of work by self-study scholars. So Mercer's 5 methodological 5 components include situated inquiry, critical collaborative inquiry, improved learning, transparent and systematic processes, and knowledge generations and presentation. The self-study methodology at its core is a self-development process, a revolution, or I would say a paradigm shift. The self-study research requires critical reflection of own learning history and teaching practices. What is my initial thought? What is the contribution of critical friends? How could I harness the data and findings to improve my teaching strategies?
Now, I'm really curious about what occurred during your self study process. How did the data that you collect contribute to the development of your understanding of teaching?
Well, the data can mainly be categorized into 3 sections: a personal history, a critical reflection of my placement, critical friends' responses. A critical piece of the self-study is the narrative that explores my education life history. I followed Maggie's extensive narrative introduction to her self-study as a means to reflect on my English learning history in the context that produced my teaching philosophy. My English study journey has three successful stages: fundamental training stage, knowledge accumulation stage, and the transition stage. The fundamental training stage covers my first 5 years of English learning experience and mainly focus on basic English elements such as phonetic symbols. I still frequently recall me sitting in the classroom following teacher's instruction on how to pronounce each syllable. The knowledge building process is always a trivial but beneficial section. English teaching in my home country is broken down into the individual knowledge points to learn. For example, sometimes the word to appears before the base form. English was not regarded as an ideographic language in China. I remembered in the middle of school, in the middle school, 20% of the time was spent on the test. We were required to read the paragraph aloud, and the rest of the time was given to do all kinds of activities. My transformation stage happened at university. I was fortunate to have a teacher who had studied and lived in London for almost 10 years. She shared her English learning experience to convince us that it's never right to simply pursue the correctness of expression and to confine ourselves to the language itself. On the contrary, let English influence our interest, profession, and life. Do everything in English and evolve from learning the language to learning the culture and seek a bigger world. That experience also made me realize that the rules of grammar and vocabulary were not just were just external manifestations of English thinking. Under her instruction, I managed to develop the habit of reading original English materials. It is always attractive for me to discover diverse writing styles, and this is how gradually I comprehend the beauty of English.
Well, I like this story.
Yeah, so you could understand why I lean towards the communicative language teaching method after doing some researches. The problem is, after discussing my initial thoughts with my critical friends, I realized that this problem is not that easy to solve. I managed to invite 4 teachers candidates who are currently student visa holders to express their opinions on the teaching method. Surprisingly, only one agreed with my thought, which highlights giving students opportunities to practice what they have learned. Those who are against my advocate started their study life abroad at a relatively young age. Their perspective is that we can't ignore those basic elements, definitions, common usage, word choice, etc. They recall when they were students, they always confused with those basic elements. This is compared with the text they were given to. Finnish are largely designed to develop an overall understanding. So we're talking about equilibrium in an economic class. The key is to know that the concept it has something to do with the supply and demand theory, but how could you use it appropriately? So bearing this in my mind, I commenced my first placement in the co-educational government school. To ensure ethnicity, the data connection process does not involve students' work. But there is still some tricks to reflect students' voice and reaction. That is, I managed to take notes of our students' disengagement rate and frequencies of seeking help of more knowledgeable others. And in this principle, each lesson becomes a little experiment which assess the learning outcomes of different teaching strategies. For example, in week 1, I choose to teach those specific element as part of the communicative tests and see how my students were responding to that. And in week 2, we did a different strategy, which was to separate those definitions, explanations, and corrections of the mistake from the test.
Well, I guess you must have identified some fascinating data patterns by conducting your experiment. Am I right? How did the experiment and the data support your development of a teaching approach? In other words, what did you find throughout your 7-month project?
Well, all I can tell is the data permanently shifted my way of teaching ELD learners. My previous thoughts of internet students being homogeneous is totally blinded by my experience. The truth is, every student is different. We have been instructed to be differentiated, to be student-centered. But what does it really mean when you actually deliver lessons for students? What I learned from placement is that some students learn specific elements more successfully if they are incorporated into the context. Correspondingly, the most effective way to teach them is to present grammar and economic terms within a meaning-based context. On the other hand, we also have students who learn knowledge grammar more successfully if it is separated from the context. As such, for them, grammar and other elements should be taught separately from communication activities. I was trying really hard to find the reasons behind their preference. It turns out that there could be a lot of reasons. So clearly, my thoughts, my teaching approaches at the first place was not considerable and inclusive enough. After realizing this, I decided to dig into some relevant literature. What I found is that there are actually two tributaries of the communicative language teaching strategies: isolated form-focused instruction and integrated form-focused instruction. And these two methods are meant to serve both types of students we just mentioned. According to Spada and Lightbourne, integrated FFI refers to attention to form that is embedded in communicative practice. Isolated FFI refers to attention to form that is separated from communicative practice. It is important to emphasize that both types of FFI include attention to form and meaning. Thus, isolated FFI is not the same as traditional structure-based approaches to language instruction, in which the focus was on language only. Instead, isolated FFI refers to instruction in which attention to form is delivered separately from communicative practice, but both are included. Integrated FFI refers to instruction in which attention to form and language occur simultaneously. Importantly, attention to form within isolated or integrated FFI can be explicit or implicit. The distinction between these two FFI approaches is not how attention to form is provided, but when it is provided in instructional sequence. Some of the pedagogical arguments in support of isolated FFI are that it is the natural way to teach and it is part of traditional presentation. It has also been argued that humans are limited capacity processors and can't pay attention to everything at one time. Focusing on both form and meaning is particularly difficult for those we consider low proficiency learners. Another argument is that if attention to form is provided separately from communicative practice, it is more motivating because there is no interruption in communicative interaction. On the other hand, arguments in support of integrated FFI include the claim that it is more efficient. That is, when learners have the opportunity to communicate and receive feedback on form at the same time, students get 2 for 1. It has also been argued that integrated FFI is more motivating than isolated FFI because immediate help is available to learners precisely when it is needed. It is much easier to understand this with my experience of my placement. Students who perform well on grammar tests and have learned the additional language in traditional structure-based ways are not necessarily fluent users of the test items in spontaneous speech. And many fluent speakers whose language acquisition took place primarily outside the classroom perform poorly on tests requiring metalinguistic knowledge or the retrieval of individual language features that are isolated from a communicative context. These findings might lead to the conclusion that the isolated FFI may be more effective when less salient language features are the target of instruction and are not easily heard or noticed in the input. Isolated FFI may also be more beneficial for low-level proficiency learners who will not be able to make the form meaning connections because they are having difficulty understanding the input. Isolated FFI may also be a better choice when all learners had to share the same language background and are bound to make the same mistake when learning the additional language, for example, moving from a language without a grammatical gender. On the other hand, as an integrated FFI might be beneficial for complex language features with rules that are difficult to teach in an isolated manner. Integrated FFI might also work better with task essential structures, ones that are highly likely to occur in the communicative tests.
Charlie, if you are given 30 seconds to wrap up today's podcast, what are you going to say?
I would first say thanks to this sub-study. It allows me to investigate this topic and to realize how my experience has affected my understanding of the teaching. Without conducting this research, I would never know that my position as a tertiary level international student is not necessarily the same as my students' position as high school international students. I try to probe the reasons or shared experience behind their preference. However, just a lot of factors. What really matters is that we educators tailor our instruction to serve students with different needs, level, and preferences. In our project, we can choose to use either isolated or integrated form focused instruction. And I'm sure that this project could dramatically facilitate my understanding of the students in my classes and improve my teaching. That's all I want to say.
Thank you for listening to today's Hard Talk with me and Charlie. If you're interested in his program, there is a platform called Microsoft Team where you can provide feedback and hold a conversation with Charlie. We are looking forward to your responses.